In the eyes of the public, Robert De Niro has never been just an actor, but a standard almost impossible to replace. A presence strong enough to make audiences believe they are not merely watching a story, but witnessing a real human being existing on screen. From Taxi Driver, Raging Bull to The Godfather Part II, he did not perform roles in the conventional sense, but seemed to step into the lives of those characters, live within them, and then disappear entirely so they could exist, leaving behind a sense of truth so real it is difficult to explain in the language of cinema. There was once a time when the name Robert De Niro was synonymous with certainty, that any role he chose would carry weight, depth, and something that made it impossible to look away. But over time, that feeling began to change. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way so quiet that almost no one noticed the moment it truly began. It was still that familiar face, still the gaze that once made the world pause. But the roles gradually became lighter, the choices more predictable, and the silence that once carried weight slowly turned into something harder to define. A kind of distance. There was no clear collapse to explain it. No single event large enough to mark the shift. Only a slow movement that, when looking back, makes people realize that something is no longer the same. A man once considered the standard of acting, once a name that audiences waited for every time he appeared, gradually became a presence that no longer carried the same expectation as before. And it is precisely that quiet transformation that raises the real question, because when a great actor loses his position, there is usually a clear reason. But with Robert De Niro, everything seems not to lie in what he has lost, but perhaps in the fact that he no longer needs to hold on to it. And if a person can step away from the peak without ever truly leaving, then what really happened to Robert De Niro? Did he lose himself? Or did he simply choose to step away from the version the world had grown familiar with? The childhood of Robert De Niro began on August 17th, 1943, in Manhattan, New York, a city that is never truly quiet. Yet for him, those early years carried a very particular kind of silence. His father, Robert De Niro Sr., was an abstract expressionist painter, while his mother, Virginia Admiral, was a poet and painter. They met within the world of art, but the relationship did not last. And around 1945, when De Niro was only 2 years old, they divorced. From then on, he grew up primarily with his mother in Greenwich Village, a neighborhood known for its artistic community, where ideas of freedom and creativity were always present, but also a place where the line between stability and uncertainty was fragile. Although his parents separated, they maintained a civil relationship, and De Niro continued to see his father regularly. However, she moving between two worlds, one defined by the quiet of painting, the other by the private space of his mother, led him, from an early age, to develop a sense of not fully belonging anywhere. During his elementary school years, he attended Little Red Schoolhouse, a school with a relatively progressive educational philosophy. But De Niro was not a standout student. He was quiet, introverted, and often teased by classmates for his thin appearance, to the point of earning the nickname Bobby Milk. Without resisting, without trying to change his image, he seemed to choose to step back, observing the world around him from a safer distance. Around the age of 10, he had his first encounters with the stage when he participated in a small school play, The Wizard of Oz. It was not an explosive moment, but it was the first time he experienced the feeling of becoming someone else, a state that would later become central to the way he approached acting. As a teenager, De Niro moved through several schools, including Elizabeth Irwin High School and later the High School of Music and Art. However, he did not remain long in any academic environment. By around the age of 16, he decided to leave school, a choice that was not entirely surprising, given that he had never truly integrated into the traditional education system. Instead, he began to study acting seriously, taking classes at HB Studio and later at the Stella Adler Conservatory, where he was introduced to the foundational principles of modern acting techniques. This was the period when acting was no longer a passing experience, but began to become a clear path. Not as a pursuit of fame, but as a way to understand human beings, and perhaps to find a place where he had never truly felt he belonged. Looking back, the childhood of Robert De Niro does not contain dramatic turning points, but is filled with small, quiet, continuous movements. A family that fractured very early, an artistic environment that was both nurturing and uncertain, a child who chose silence over expression, and ultimately, a decision to leave the conventional path and step into a world where he could become anyone except himself. Entering the early years of adulthood, Robert De Niro did not move toward the spotlight in the conventional way. He did not seek opportunities to be noticed, did not try to build an easily recognizable image, and did not rush into major roles. Instead, he followed an almost opposite direction, quietly digging deeper into how human beings exist from within. He studied at the Stella Adler Conservatory, where he was taught that acting begins with understanding the circumstances of a character, where they come from, what shapes them. He then continued his training with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, where method acting was pushed to its limits, not only to understand, but to live as the character. These two approaches, one rooted in analysis, the other in experience, just gradually merged to form the foundation of De Niro's distinctive style. Complete control on the outside, while internally being fully immersed in the character. During this period, he did not have many notable roles. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, he appeared in small films, independent projects, sometimes in works that were almost forgotten. But within that silence, something different was taking shape. He did not see a role as a task to be completed, but as a human being that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. Every gesture, every habit, every pause. His obsession with authenticity pushed his preparation far beyond the norm. While preparing for Mean Streets, he spent time living in Little Italy to observe the real people his character reflected. For Taxi Driver, he did not just study, but actually drove a taxi at night in New York for weeks, directly experiencing the isolation and rhythm of life that Travis Bickle carried. And with Raging Bull, the transformation did not stop at psychology. He trained in boxing to the point of being able to compete, then gained nearly 30 kilograms so that his body would accurately reflect the character's decline. These things were not done to impress. De Niro did not speak much about his methods, nor did he try to turn them into a personal image. For him, they were simply necessary to eliminate any distance between himself and the role. If there was still an awareness that he was acting, then it was not yet real enough. Because of that, even before becoming famous, he was already different. Not because he tried to stand out, but because he did not care about standing out. While many sought to be seen, De Niro sought to disappear more completely with each appearance. And perhaps it was precisely that paradox that defined his entire path. An actor who did not want to be seen, yet became someone the world could not look away from. The true turning point in the career of Robert De Niro did not arrive as a sudden explosion, but more like an accumulation that had gone on long enough that it could no longer be ignored. And the clearest starting point of that shift was Mean Streets, the film that marked his first collaboration with Martin Scorsese, a partnership that not only shaped both of their careers, but also changed the way cinema understood acting itself. In Mean Streets, De Niro was not the central character in the traditional sense, yet his Johnny Boy was something no one could look away from. Unstable, impulsive, dangerous in an unpredictable way. The character was not performed, but seemed to exist independently of the script. And from that moment, Hollywood began to realize that this was not an ordinary actor. Just a year later, The Godfather Part II placed him directly into a position that very few could reach so quickly. Taking on the role of the young Vito Corleone, a character already powerfully defined by Marlon Brando, was a significant risk. But instead of imitation, De Niro chose complete reinvention. He learned Sicilian Italian, studied every detail of how Brando had built the character, yet ultimately created a different version, quieter, more reserved, but carrying an undeniable internal weight. The role earned him an Academy Award, but more importantly, it confirmed one thing. De Niro could step into great icons without being consumed by them. Then came Taxi Driver, where everything moved beyond the realm of a great performance and became a cultural symbol. Travis Bickle was not just a character, but a state, isolated, fractured, and gradually slipping away from reality. The line, "You talkin' to me," was not written as an iconic moment, but emerged almost spontaneously in a space where De Niro had fully merged with the character. There was no clear boundary between actor and role, only a man confronting himself in the mirror. And it is in this period that something becomes clear. De Niro did not approach acting as a way to express, but as a process of removal. He did not add emotion, but stripped away what was not real. He did not construct characters from the outside, but allowed them to form from within, to the point where he himself disappeared. He did not act. He vanished. And in that absence, the character began to exist. The peak period of Robert De Niro was not when he appeared the most, but when every appearance became a new standard. After his initial breakthroughs, De Niro did not stop, but continued pushing his approach further, to the point where acting was no longer a technique, but a form of total transformation, both psychologically and physically. The Deer Hunter is one of the clearest demonstrations of that. In the role of Michael, De Niro did not rely on grand expressions or showy dialogue, yet every glance, every silence carried a weight that is difficult to explain. The character was not performed, but seemed to be held back, compressed, and it was precisely that restraint that created depth. He did not try to make the audience feel. He allowed them to feel on their own. But it was not until Raging Bull that all limits were truly broken. To embody Jake LaMotta, De Niro did not just learn boxing. He lived within the world of a fighter, experiencing the rhythm of a body pushed to its limits. Then, he deliberately gained nearly 30 kilograms to portray the character's decline. A decision that was not merely visual, but one that completely altered the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he existed within each frame. This was no longer acting in the conventional sense, but a reconstruction of a human being from both the inside and the outside. By the time of Cape Fear, even past his initial peak, he continued to maintain the same level of obsession with authenticity. Max Cady was not a character designed to frighten, but a man existing within his own logic, terrifying not because of his actions, but because of his calmness, his consistency, and his near unpredictability. De Niro did not need to exaggerate. He simply needed to exist in the right way, and that alone created a lasting sense of unease. It is during this period that something became undeniable. Robert De Niro had become the gold standard of acting, not because he was the only one capable of it, but because he had established a level against which every other actor would be measured. And the audience changed with him. They no longer watched films merely for entertainment. When De Niro appeared, they expected an experience, something so real it could not be questioned. They did not just look at the character, but believed in its existence. Believed that behind the screen, there was a man who had truly lived that life, even if only for a brief moment. At that peak, De Niro was no longer just an actor. He was proof that cinema could move beyond the limits of illusion. And from that point on, he set a standard that he himself would later have to confront. After reaching a peak that very few could attain, Robert De Niro did not move forward in the way the public might expect. He did not expand his personal image, did not leverage his fame to become a more accessible icon, and did not step into the machinery of media exposure like many of his contemporaries. Instead, he chose a quieter path, controlling his presence by minimizing it. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, De Niro rarely appeared in long interviews, shared little about his personal views, and almost never explained his acting methods. When he spoke briefly. When asked, he often avoided going deeper, not because he lacked something to say, but because he seemed to believe that he did not need to be understood in the way the public expected. In an era when the image of a star was increasingly constructed with intention, where actors became brands, where every appearance was calculated to reinforce their position, De Niro moved in the opposite direction. He did not create a clear public persona. There was no easily recognizable version of Robert De Niro off-screen. No repeated narratives designed to define who he was. The only thing the public truly knew were the characters he had embodied, and that absence itself became a form of control. By not explaining himself, he preserved the space. By not appearing too often, he preserved the weight of each appearance. By refusing to be defined, he avoided being confined. Gradually, he separated himself from the rhythm of Hollywood publicity, not through any public declaration, but through a very slow withdrawal. He continued to work, continued to appear on screen, but was no longer part of the system that constructed the image around it. He did not chase attention, did not maintain constant visibility, did not try to keep himself at the center of every conversation. And perhaps that was not a loss. He did not lose the mystery. He chose to keep it. Because for De Niro, The value of an actor does not lie in the audience fully understanding who they are, but in the audience being unable to see through them when they become someone else. And to do that, sometimes the most necessary thing is silence. Then came a period when the change was no longer a vague feeling, but began to appear clearly in each choice made by Robert De Niro. There was no public decision, no declaration that he would change direction. Yet the trajectory of his roles gradually moved away from what had once defined his name. Complex, psychologically heavy characters that demanded a complete disappearance began to give way to roles that were more accessible, lighter, and more openly geared toward entertainment. When Meet the Parents was released, audiences saw a very different Robert De Niro for the first time. He still retained his familiar seriousness, but this time it did not create psychological depth. It became a source of humor. The character Jack Burns was not a person to be explored from within, but a structure designed to serve comedic rhythm. And what is notable is, it worked. The film was a major success, opening a commercial path that De Niro had rarely stepped into before. But from that point, a deeper shift began to unfold. In the years that followed, he appeared more frequently, but not in the kind of event projects that once defined his career. Instead, there was a range of roles spanning comedies, action films, and mid-level projects that his name had rarely been associated with before. There were still moments where he brought depth, brief flashes where the old De Niro was unmistakably present, but they were no longer central, no longer the default standard. What changed was not only the genre, but the level of immersion. In the past, each role was a process of total reconstruction, from body to psychology. Now, too many roles seem to exist only at the level of functional presence. He no longer needed to disappear completely for the character to exist, and that created the sense that a crucial part of the way he once worked was no longer a priority. The gap between Robert De Niro of the past and Robert De Niro of the present thus became clearer than ever. Not because he had become weaker in a technical sense, but because the standard he once set for himself was no longer consistently maintained. And the public began to ask questions, not loudly, but as a quiet doubt. Was this a sign of decline when an actor can no longer sustain his peak? Or was it a conscious choice, when someone who has reached every limit no longer sees a reason to keep pushing himself to that extreme? Had he lost what once defined him? Or had he simply chosen not to live within the standard he himself created? There is no clear answer, because De Niro does not explain. But it is precisely that silence that makes the shift more profound. Because when an actor once obsessed with authenticity begins to accept more comfortable choices, the question is no longer whether he can do it well, but how much he still wants to. At a certain point, what changed was no longer in the roles or the choices, but in the way the public responded to Robert De Niro. The name still carried its weight. It still held a history that very few could reach. But the feeling each time he appeared was no longer the same. There was a time when De Niro's presence was an event. It didn't need heavy promotion, didn't need manufactured hype. His mere appearance in a film was enough to make audiences pause, pay attention, and wait. But gradually, that disappeared. He still appeared regularly, even more often, yet that presence no longer carried the same weight. There was no longer the sense of, this is something you cannot miss. no longer the feeling that each role would be a singular experience. The name Robert De Niro began to transform from a specific person into a brand, a symbol so clearly defined that every appearance afterward could hardly escape the shadow it had already created. Audiences no longer looked at the character to discover, but looked at De Niro to compare. And when that comparison repeats long enough, it creates a distance. They still respect him, still acknowledge what he has done, but they are no longer drawn in the same way. Not because he lost his ability, but because expectations changed. When an actor has once set the standard, every appearance that follows is measured against that same scale. And when new roles no longer reach that level, even slightly, a sense of disappointment begins to accumulate, quietly but continuously. Gradually, a paradox takes shape. The more famous De Niro becomes, but the more he is recognized as a legend, the harder it becomes for audiences to forget that and believe in someone else. He no longer disappears completely as before, not because he cannot, but because his name has become too large to dissolve so easily. And it is there that the distance appears, not the distance between actor and role, but the distance between legend and present reality. One side is an image carved deeply into collective memory. The other is what is happening right now. And between those two, Robert De Niro still stands, not entirely belonging to the past, yet no longer felt in the same way. And after all those shifts, Robert De Niro seems to return, but not in the way people once expected. Not a rebirth in the sense of restoring him to his former peak, but a kind of re-emergence shaped by reflection, where new roles do not exist independently, but resonate like echoes of his own past. The Irishman, 2019, marks his reunion with Martin Scorsese, a collaboration that once defined the most important chapters of his career. This time, De Niro is no longer the young man disappearing into explosive characters, but a person who has moved through time, carrying fatigue, silence, and unfillable voids. Frank Sheeran is not a character to be performed, but a life being looked back upon, slow, cold, and almost incapable of escaping itself. In Joker, 2019, to his role as Murray Franklin becomes a different kind of presence. Not central, but symbolic. Here, De Niro does not disappear, but exists as the very image he once represented. A talk show host, a media figure, a part of the system the main character resists. The feeling is no longer, this is a character, but this is Robert De Niro in a familiar role. A recognition that cannot be separated. And in Killers of the Flower Moon, 2023, he returns once again with Scorsese, but this time his presence carries a different tone. No longer explosive or completely vanishing, but a form of subtle control. Every word, every glance deliberate, yet no longer attempting to conceal himself as before. The character exists, but De Niro exists alongside it. And it is here that the difference becomes clearest. Not because he has diminished, not because he no longer has the ability to go as deep as before, but because the audience now sees him too clearly. After decades, after countless roles that have become iconic, De Niro is no longer an empty space for characters to fill. He becomes part of the viewing experience itself. People do not only see the character, they simultaneously see him, his history, his style, everything he has once done. And when that happens, the complete disappearance, the very thing that defined his legend, becomes almost impossible to repeat. These new roles, therefore, carry a very particular feeling. They are no longer beginnings, but something closer to echoes. Echoes of a time when an actor could step onto the screen and cease entirely to be himself. The legacy of Robert De Niro does not lie in the number of roles he has played, nor in the awards he has received, even though they are enough to place him on any list of the greatest. What he left behind runs deeper than that. He did not simply succeed within the film industry. He changed the way that system understands acting itself. Before De Niro, acting, despite having made significant progress, was still often seen as a skill, a combination of emotion, technique, and the ability to perform. But with him, everything shifted in another direction. Acting was no longer about portraying a person, but about becoming that person from within, to the point where no distance remained between the performer and the character. The way he prepared for roles, living as the character, transforming his body, while immersing himself in real environments, did not just impress. It gradually became a new standard. Not everyone would go that far, but after De Niro, no one could fully return to the old way without being compared. His influence spread across generations. Names like Daniel Day-Lewis and Joaquin Phoenix are not copies of De Niro, but in their methods, there is something familiar, a sense of devotion, extremity, and the belief that to reach truth on screen, one must sometimes pass through the limits of oneself. But what matters most is not how many were influenced, but how the audience changed because of him. After De Niro, people no longer simply watched acting. They began to search for truth. They no longer accepted emotions that were merely performed, but wanted to feel something that seemed impossible to fake. A new standard emerged, not from theory, but from the experience he created. And because of that, Robert De Niro's legacy does not lie in how many roles he has played, or how many peaks he has reached. It lies in the fact that he made an entire generation, both actors and audiences, see acting in a different way. Not as an art of performance, but as an art of disappearance. The journey of Robert De Niro was never a straight line that could be easily read, but rather a slow movement, where each phase does not replace the one before it, but layers over it, forming an image that becomes increasingly difficult to define. He began as an almost invisible actor, someone who observed more than he expressed, growing up in silence and entering acting not to be seen, but to step away from himself. And then, over time, that very person became a global standard, a name powerful enough to shape how the entire film industry understands truth. Yet there is one thing that has remained almost unchanged throughout that journey. He never truly tried to control how the world perceived him. He did not build an image to maintain, did not adjust himself to meet expectations, and did not explain when a distance began to appear between who he once was and who the audience believed they were seeing. That silence made every shift harder to grasp, because there was no confirmation, no defining moment that could declare what had truly ended. And perhaps that is the answer behind everything that has unfolded. Some artists do not disappear because they become weaker, nor because they lose their ability, but because they reach a point where continuing to prove themselves no longer carries the same meaning. They do not leave the peak through collapse. They simply stop climbing. Stop trying to sustain a version the world has grown accustomed to. Robert De Niro, in his own way, has not disappeared from cinema, nor has he stepped away from his place in history. He has only withdrawn from the expectations once placed upon him, and in that quiet space, his presence no longer carries the same weight as before. But perhaps that is not a loss, but a rare kind of freedom. When a person no longer needs to exist as a standard, no longer needs to prove anything, and no longer needs to be seen in the way they once were. And after all of that, Robert De Niro still stands there, not as a clear answer, but as a silence stretched across decades, an actor, a symbol, and above all, a person who never felt the need to explain himself to the world. He has moved through every phase a career can endure, from anonymity to the peak, and then into changes not everyone understands. But throughout that journey, one thing has remained almost unchanged. He has never tried to define himself in the way the public expects. He does not hold on to an old image simply because it was once loved, and he does not speak out to adjust how others perceive him. And perhaps that is why the story of Robert De Niro does not end with a clear conclusion, but settles into a feeling that he never truly lost himself. He only stepped away from the version that the world once required him to maintain. In an industry where everything is seen, explained, and constantly defined, his silence becomes something rare. Not a void that needs to be filled, but a choice, a way of existing without the need for validation. And perhaps that is what remains after everything. Not fame, not legend, but a person who never needed to become anything other than himself. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Icons and Legacies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.
Thank you.